Thank you very much. I'm conscious there are a few more after me, and somebody said there was a meal, so we'll keep moving on so that we do get through this day. Just in preparing my remarks today, I couldn't help but, because we've probably listened to it so much in the last month, President John F. Kennedy's famous visit to this city. I had a chance of walking around it last night and during the afternoon, and given the amount of coverage that there has been on the 50th anniversary, I suppose particularly in Ireland, of his assassination, it's not surprising that he would come into our thoughts. And I still remember that summer of 1963, when I was still a schoolboy and beginning to take an interest in local issues around me, not knowing much about the world, but I remember vividly the excitement and the build-up of his visit to my native city in Dublin, and to seeing him and our then President De Valera travel through the city. And little did I or anyone else know that a few short months ago there would be another cavalcade, which we've seen so much on our TV recently in Dallas and Texas. But on that occasion, the cheers were silenced by the gunshots and the tragedy. And when Kennedy came to Dublin, he travelled, of course, from this city directly from having made a speech there. And it was then a divided city, now thankfully united as the capital of a democratic and free Germany, that he made one of his most iconic speeches of all his time. And on the 26th of June 63, just a few hours before he left this city to come to Dublin, and apologies for my bad German pronunciation, but ich bin ein Berliner, he made that wonderful speech. And of course he said, and I quote, "There are many people in the world who really don't understand what is the great issue between the free world and the communist world. Let them come to Berlin. There are some who say that communism is the wave of the future. Let them come to Berlin. And there are some who say in Europe and elsewhere we can work with the communists. Let them come to Berlin." The end of quote. And today I've dwelled on what President Kennedy said, not because it's the 50th anniversary or because today I've made the reverse journey that he made a half a century ago, because his speech and the context of its time shows us how fast the pace of human history moves. And listening to the debates here in the last few days, you can just see how that has moved on. But it is deeply relevant to us today when we consider the future of cultural diplomacy and its power for good, not just today or tomorrow, but in the medium-term future. When John F. Kennedy made the speech here, as the words I've quoted reflect, the world was a very different place. It was a place, in effect, divided into two powerful armed camps, divided by ideology and suspicion. And Berlin was at the crucible of that division. And in short, the transatlantic relationship 50 years ago came down to a great chasm defined, as we all grew up, as East versus West. And in that era, transatlantic cultural diplomacy was also very different than it is today. Cultural diplomacy was another front in the Cold War, and it was often a means for the competing power blocks to advance the cause of capitalism or communism in emerging nations. One of our colleagues today at the advisory board was saying some of the things that are happening in parts of Eastern Europe today, and it reminded me of what I recently had read, an intriguing study of cultural diplomacy by the senior American diplomat Elena Finn, who served in Cyrus Vance's Fellow at the Council of Foreign Relations. And Finn noted that during the Cold War, the United States viewed cultural diplomacy as so integral to defeating communism that it was funded by the Central Intelligence Agency. I'm not considering that Mark solves his problem by doing that. But while acknowledging that CIA sponsorship would be inappropriate and counterproductive today, Finn gives an interesting historical analysis when she observes, and I quote, "Cold War policymakers understood the link between engagement with foreign audiences and victory over ideological enemies, and considered cultural diplomacy vital to US national identity. And throughout the post-war era, desperate and disenfranchised young people in developing countries sought solace in communism. And rather than allow this trend to continue unchecked, American officials mounted a determined and ultimately successful ideological campaign response. And few Americans, she said, appreciate the degree to which knowledge about American culture, whether acquired by participating in our exchange programs, attending our cultural preparations, or simply listening to the voice of America, contributed to the death of communism, end of quote. Today, cultural diplomacy should exist not as a Cold War type weapon or an ideological tool, but as a means to promote peace and prosperity and progress across the globe. In my country, since my time as Prime Minister, we've seen the fruits of commitments to cultural diplomacy, not just in the former conflict zone of Northern Ireland, but also in the Republic of Ireland's own difficult relationship with our neighbour, the United Kingdom. The conflict in Northern Ireland in its later years was fuelled as much by generations of suspicion and enmity as it was by a territorial dispute. The Good Friday Agreement, which I and Tony Blair negotiated, was largely a political and constitutional settlement. But what many people don't recognise is that there was a significant element of cultural diplomacy embedded in that landmark peace accord. I think the great thing about the Good Friday Agreement is that it created a new beginning in relationships on the island of Ireland for people from our two traditions of nationalism and unionism. And it opened a space in which our different cultures can be experienced, shared and enjoyed by the people of the whole island of Ireland, free from political overtones in the past, alienated different groups and communities from elements of our common heritage. And anyone who wants to see cultural diplomacy and its fruits in action should look at the provisions of the Good Friday Agreement. It's not too long of a document, and it promotes non-sectarianism and upholds cultural respect and diversity. And in particular, the agreement contains a recognition by both governments and the political parties of understanding and tolerance in relation to linguistic diversity, including the Irish language and Ulster Scots. Thankfully, the emphasis we placed on culture has given rise to a new climate of cultural ecumenism that underpins peace. And I think that it is great that in recent times we've seen an increase in Northern Protestants taking an interest in the Irish language, and similarly the growth of Irish dancing in loyalist areas throughout Northern Ireland is another indication of an increased interest and participation in our shared cultural heritage. As a cultural diplomacy initiative, the governments which I led resolved to take an inclusive approach to Irish history, which has often been contentious, tribal and a source of ongoing grievance. We took active steps to promote and demonstrate its respect for the different traditions on the island of Ireland through historical commemoration. I believe that the Irish state's new willingness to acknowledge not only the heroic contribution of those who fought for Irish independence in our revolutionary period from 1916 to 1921, but also for those Irish men from north and south who fought under the banner of the British Empire in World War I, has been an important aspect of fostering reconciliation and mutual understanding between all the people of our island in a relationship with the neighbouring island of Britain. On a wider level, my government has also used cultural diplomacy to foster our trade and tourism objectives, and the present government have continued that. We've been well assisted by some very good Irish artists of one kind or another. Seamus Heaney, who's been mentioned to me a number of times in the last few days, who died quite recently. Of course, you too are known the world over, and a whole host of others. And of course, our ability to have an Irish pub in every city in the world knows no bounds. Guinness is known everywhere, from the Seychelles to China and back, from the biggest to the smallest. And of course, St. Patrick's Day is a festival of international note, where no decent Irish person do other than drink anyway. And the rest of the world joins us as well. And the new and global understanding of our culture and traditions has confronted and largely overcome anti-Irish prejudice, which were commonplace in Britain and in the United States, in particular in the 19th and 20th century. And it took us a long time to overcome those prejudices, and thankfully this generation has gained the benefits of that, where they can work freely from Australia to America and in every part of the world, and are welcomed in such open arms situation. Our commitment as a country to cultural diplomacy and the benefits we've accrued from it is something that other European nations, and in particular I think the European Union, could learn from, as we seek to build a new era of peace and prosperity and progress on the continents of Europe, and to export these benefits to the rest of the global village. I genuinely believe that the work of the Institute of Cultural Diplomacy in Berlin, and particularly a commitment to pushing cultural diplomacy as an academic discipline for young people, is a profoundly positive step, and it will lay solid foundations for future progress. If the leaders of tomorrow have a solid grounding in cultural diplomacy and an understanding that embracing diversity is a wider path than imposing conformity, then humanity's future can be very bright. I'm also encouraged by the European Union's growing commitment to cultural diplomacy as a means to promote international harmony and understanding. Anyone interested in this should study the European Parliament's resolution of the 12th of May 2011 on the cultural dimensions of the EU's external actions, and the set of commitments that are outlined in that will help not only to underpin a vibrant transatlantic relationship, but it also contains the potential to improve the European Union's relations with developing nations around the globe. And I'm not going to quote from all of the resolutions of that European Parliament, but I do think the Institute, and as a point made today, just how we focus ourselves as an institute of what we do going forward, we should look at those principles, because I think they're easy adopted to what we're trying to do. It underlines the cross-cutting nature of the importance of culture in all aspects of life, and believes that culture needs to be taken into consideration in all external policies of the European Union. It stresses the need for all European Union institutions to recognise more fully the value of culture as a force for understanding and tolerance, and not only as a tool of growth and more inclusive societies. And it stresses that democratic and fundamental freedoms, such as freedom of expression, press freedom, freedom from want, freedom from fear, freedom from imbalance and intolerance, hatred, and freedom to access and printed and digital information, as well as the privilege to communicate. All these are outlined, and a whole lot more that goes on and on, but I think it has a very good basis of what we should be trying to do. I'm not going to quote any more from that, but I do, particularly to people interested, and particularly to students, just to look at the full extent of them, because I think it is what cultural diplomacy should be about and what it can be about. As Europe is now increasingly recognising the value of cultural diplomacy as a means for peace and prosperity to permeate across the globe, there's also a great and positive synergy happening with America's foreign policy, once again embracing the values of cultural diplomacy. On the Agenda Council, or on our own Advisory Council, I and hopefully others will be working on that in the year ahead. But at the end of the Cold War, cultural diplomacy went out of vogue in the United States. The disintegration of the Soviet Union saw an emergence of a school of thought in Washington that believed that the United States could cut back on foreign policy expenditure, in particular diplomatic engagements. In the 1990s, President Clinton, and he had an undoubted commitment to global solutions, was challenged and significantly thwarted by an isolationist Congress, who argued that American taxpayers' resources should not be deployed in disseminating information and building understanding through education and cultural exchange. And in that period, not just US cultural diplomacy, but wider diplomacy was under assault. And this viewpoint, I suppose, was best encapsulated by Ross Perot's fatuous comments when he said, "What do we need diplomats for? Just send a fax machine." I remember also the leader of the opposition in Ireland, when I was leader of the opposition in Ireland, being concerned but powerless to do anything when I heard that the Dayton Accord was being put into effect, at the same time that the United States was shutting its Centre for Democracy in Vienna, which has been established as a neutral meeting ground and a space for reconciliation among the Serbs and the Bosnians at the time. If anything, Americans' retreat from cultural diplomacy accelerated in the Bush era. I want to stress that George W. Bush was very helpful to me, and I was very friendly with him to promote peace in Ireland, and he was a man of many qualities. But there's no doubt that the international reputation of America took a huge hit during his presidency, and there are a myriad of factors to explain this, including his readiness to reject or to renege on a range of international agreements, from the Rome Statutes of the International Criminal Court to the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty and the Kyoto Protocol to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and they went on. His administration's decision, of course, in 2003 to go to war in Iraq in conflict with the UN Security Council had its own difficulties, which have been well addressed in these few days. But President Obama has placed a renewed emphasis on cultural diplomacy, and I think this is good for transatlantic relationship and good for world stability. And I think in particular the President's commitment in his second inaugurational speech at the start of this year are significant. At a time when the eyes of the world were on America, it was heartening to hear President Obama talk in strongly non-isolationist terms and to strongly commit the United States to a leadership role in promoting democracy and humanitarian aid right across the world. And specifically, President Obama said, and I quote, "We will support democracy from Asia to Africa, from the Americas to the Middle East, because our interests and our conscience compel us to act on behalf of those who long for freedom. And we must be a source of hope to the poor, the sick, the marginalised, the victims of prejudice, not out of mere charity, but because people in our time requires in constant advance of those principles that our common creed describes: tolerance and opportunity, human dignity and justice." End of quote. And I believe that this commitment to support freedom and to help the world's poorest of the poor reflects an essential decency that encompasses all that should be best in the transatlantic relationship. That relationship, if it is to be a force for good, cannot be self-serving, and it must serve wider global geopolitical interests as well. And I know that there is concern, particularly in Europe, that since President Obama has said that the US must shift some of its focus from Europe to Asia, that there are fears about the future of the transatlantic relationship. It's important that such fears do not paralyse our ability to deal with realities. The facts are that the world is becoming more multipolar, and the transatlantic relationship must adapt to this and use it as an opportunity, and cultural diplomacy has a role to play in that. But first of all, before I say anything about that, I think we should not argue about the inevitable. It's usually a waste of time, and we're all busy people and we all try to do things constructive in our lives. And I think arguing against the inevitable, unless you have nothing to do, is a total waste of your effort and time. And I think Asia and China's emergence is going to shift the balance of world economics and political power, and that is an undeniable fact, whether we like it or whether we don't. And numerous studies of academic credibility show that Asia is on course to overtake Europe and North America combined in terms of power calculated from GDP, from population, defence spending and investments in technology from 2030, some would argue earlier. There is no other study saying anything else. I think it is just a lost cause argument about it. I think for many European policy analysts and economists, this is a cause for worry. It comes up time and time again in conferences, and I just believe that we shouldn't worry about this issue. I think it's a matter that doesn't really affect us at all. I was in China recently. I've been in many of the good cities in China, but recently I was down in the beautiful province of Hainan, down in the South China Sea, and I met Mr. Li Boeing there, who is a man of great vision and leadership, and he's secretary of the Hainan Provincial Committee of the CPC, and he's been pressing the concept of green development, and as a lifeline for Hainan's throughout his term as governor and as party secretary, concerned about environmental matters. And no matter where you go in the world, I think you wouldn't meet a person who's more concerned about it. And his leadership, I think, is inspiring, and his environmental policies are a credit to his achievements and scientific development of a green rising, which he sees as the basic foundation for one of the smaller states in China. And many of his policies are being taken up in the last Congress, and I think he has over 60% of his state is in forestry. He has hugely progressive scientific and environmental policies, and sure many of you have been in Sanya in that area, which is a tropical climate and great weather all the year round, unlike my country. But the good environment of Hainan is endowed by nature and by, more importantly, carefully protecting what is good. And I think I mention it because these policies are as good as anything you'd see anywhere in the world. So rather than being concerned that their GDP will overtake us and we lose out on these things, I think is just not something we should worry about. And I have seen, having travelled that region as a planner and a practitioner of Hainan's ecological protection, that Mr. Li has been careful to look all over the world to see where ecological protection can develop, and he has given many good writings on that under the Green Writing, Green Island, building a green Great Wall of ecological protection. I think it's interesting for people to look at that. It's all well on the web. Also, his period as secretary of the Hainan Committee of the CPC, he has used his policies in that area to pioneering the practice of looking at ecological problems under global issues and looking at climate change and environmental overloading and resource. And he innovatively proposed that ecological environment has become a major selling point and a key attraction for his area. So when I go to conferences and I hear people always worrying that nobody cares about these things in China and it'll all affect us, it's just not true. And I think Mr. Law, he has stressed for more than once the different occasions that the Green Island campaign is having throughout China, and I just think it's something we should not be so concerned about. But we need to recognise that the emergence of Asia need not mean the transatlantic relationship will not continue to be at the core of global affairs. The underlying economic strength of the transatlantic relationship means that its influence is not going to simply evaporate. The fact is that the EU and the US enjoy the most integrated economic relationship in the world. Our economies account for 40% of the entire world GDP. Total investment in the EU is 3 times higher than in all of Asia, and currently 15 million jobs depend on EU-US trade. And the bottom line is that both the European Union and the US have a lot at stake and can ill afford to ignore the unique potential for growth. So I think we can safely assume that the transatlantic relationship will continue to be deeply relevant irrespective of the emergence of Asia and other parts of the world. And I believe the challenge and the opportunity now is for EU and the US to use its special relationship to build new alliances and better relationships with societies vulnerable to radicalism. And this will not only benefit the EU and US, and we hope to try and do some of that within our own advisory council and within this institute. In particular, cultural diplomacy offers a means to arrest the alarming rise in anti-Western sentiment, some of which has roots in the Middle East, of course, we were talking about earlier. And the transatlantic relationship should focus on reversing this tide through cultural diplomacy and through a genuine effort to understand the Muslim world and to extend the hand of friendship to it. And the cultural diplomacy we need is, as I said, not the type of Cold War diplomacy where one power seeks to establish ideological supremacy over another. Instead, we need today is a genuine effort by the transatlantic powers to engage with Islam. And we also need to be patient. Cultural diplomacy is a long-term project, and its positive effects will not simply happen like the wave of a magic wand, but if we stick with it, we will pass on a better, a fairer, more equitable world to the next generation. And I started by talking about President Kennedy, and I'd like to finish with was probably one of his speeches that was the most inspiring words, when he said, "Let us not blind to our differences, but let us direct attention to our common interests and to the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help the world to be safer for diversity." For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet, we all breathe the same air, we all cherish our children's future, and we're all mortal. And I think that true cultural diplomacy should be informed by these fine principles. And thank you for listening to me so late into the evening.